She had everything until she had to hide her own face to survive. When beauty becomes a curse and staying unseen is the only way to stay alive, how far would you go? This is a story of obsession, betrayal, and a deadly game for survival. The truth will shock you. It was a morning like any other, or at least it should have been. Winnie walked down the same eerie, lonely Samuel Jackson Street, the route she took to school every day at exactly 6 a.m. The street was always empty at this hour, silent, isolated. But today, something was different. The silence felt heavier, almost suffocating, the air colder. It wasn't just emptiness, it was a void, a deep, unsettling sensation that curled around Winnie like an invisible mist as she walked. She couldn't explain it, but something was off. Shrugging off the ominous feeling creeping up her spine, Winnie quickened her pace. Her school was still miles away, but just as she took a few more steps, a voice, low and rasping, called out behind her, "Winnie!" Winnie froze. Her breath hitched. A sudden chill coursed through her veins. Slowly she turned, her heart hammering in her chest. The vision wasn't clear at first, and then she saw it. A frail, haggard old woman stood a short distance away, leaning heavily on a crooked walking stick. Her gaze, piercing and unsettling, locked onto Winnie's with an intensity that made her stomach twist. A shiver ran through her. Who was this woman? And how in the world did she know her name? The old woman's lips parted, but before Winnie could react, the distance between them vanished. And then, the old woman was right in front of her. No movement, no steps. Just there. Winnie barely suppressed a scream. Stretching out a frail hand, the old woman presented a small bottle of oil, tightly sealed. Her voice, now firm and commanding, cut through the morning stillness. "Take this. Apply it all over your body before you reach school. It will save you." Winnie's mind reeled. "Who are you?" she wanted to scream. Instead, she whispered, "How do you know my name? And why should I take something from a total stranger?" The woman said nothing more. She simply placed the bottle on the ground, turned, and began to walk away. Before Winnie could blink, the old woman was gone, vanished into thin air. Winnie's body trembled. The street was empty again, as if the woman had never existed. A fresh wave of terror gripped her. Her legs begged her to run, to flee from whatever had just transpired. Yet, something stopped her. Her gaze fell on the bottle. Tiny, harmless looking, yet radiating an inexplicable energy. A war raged inside her mind. Had she just encountered something divine? Was this a warning? A blessing? A curse? With heart pounding, Winnie bent down, hesitated for a moment, then picked up the bottle. And against every rational thought, she decided to follow the woman's instruction. Blossombried High was empty when Winnie finally arrived. As always, she was the first to step through the school gates. A heavy sigh of relief escaped her lips. She had made it. Whatever that strange encounter had been, it was over now, or so she thought. She had barely taken 5 steps toward the school building when a hand suddenly tapped on her shoulder from behind. Winnie spun around to see who tapped her, but it was too late. A masked man, standing just inches away, flung a scalding liquid directly onto her face. Her vision blurred. Pain. Unimaginable, searing pain. Winnie screamed. Her skin was burning, her face was melting, her hands on fire. The man immediately vanished into the morning mist. Winnie's screams tore through the schoolyard. She clawed at her burning skin, the acrid scent of something terrible filling her nostrils. Her hands, her face, her entire being was on fire. Acid. Someone had poured acid on her. With vision blurred by tears, Winnie staggered, then bolted blindly to the girls' bathroom. Inside, she collapsed against the sink, panting, sobbing. For 5 torturous minutes, Winnie refused to face the mirror. Her mind spiraled. What if my face is gone? What if I'm unrecognizable? What if I'm a monster? Finally, with trembling fingers, she forced herself to look, but what she saw stopped her breath. Nothing. Her reflection stared back at her. Untouched. Her skin, smooth, radiant, as if nothing had happened. No burns, no scars, nothing. Winnie's fingers frantically traced her cheeks, her jaw, her forehead. Not a single mark. The acid gone. The burns non-existent. Disbelief washed over her. How? How could this be? The pain had been real. The burns had been real. Yet her reflection told another story. Then it hit her. The oil. Winnie staggered backward, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The old woman, the warning, the oil, it had saved her. And yet the relief was fleeting. A darker realization sank in. Her life was in danger. Someone wanted her destroyed. Someone wanted her beauty erased. Her mind raced. Who would hate her enough to do this? Who could be so filled with envy, so ruthless that they would try to mutilate her forever? And the most chilling question of all, who was the old woman? Who was the masked man? Winnie had to find out. She had to uncover the truth. But the answer might be more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. Still shaken from the horrifying incident, Winnie fled from school that morning before the other students could arrive. She sprinted through the quiet streets, her heart pounding like a war drum, her breath ragged with fear and fury. But as she ran, something caught her eye. A motorcycle shop. Something inside her made her halt abruptly. She stood there staring through the glass, her mind racing, and then, as if possessed by an unshakable resolve, she stepped inside. Moments later, she emerged, gripping a helmet tightly in her hands. Without a second thought, she hurried home. The moment Winnie burst through the front door of their grand mansion, her mother, Thelma, was there, pacing the sitting room, anxiety carved deep into her features. The instant she laid eyes on her daughter, her trembling hands clutching a strange helmet, panic seized her. What happened to your face?" Thelma's voice quivered with desperation. Winnie's eyes burned with rage. "Someone in school is trying to steal my beauty and destroy my face," she spat through clenched teeth. Before Thelma could utter another word, Winnie bolted up the stairs, slamming the door to her room behind her. She rushed to the bathroom, scrubbing at the burns on her face, washing away the remnants of the attack. Then she turned to her mirror. For the last time, she studied her reflection. This face, her face, was a target. Whoever had planned to scar her for life had to believe they had succeeded. She could not afford to let them know she had survived unscathed. If she was going to uncover the truth, if she was going to unmask the man behind the attack, she had to be smarter. No one would believe her story if her face remained unscarred, and her enemies could never suspect that she was still the same Winnie. Standing before the mirror, Winnie looked at her face for the very last time. Then she devised a plan, one that would expose those who had tried to ruin her. With unyielding determination, she lifted the helmet and placed it over her head. From that moment on, she would never take it off. From that moment on, she was a new Winnie. She became someone else. From that day forward, Winnie lived under a new identity, one she would not abandon until her enemies were brought to their knees, and that was how the story began. Before the fateful day of February 11th, before the first attempt to erase her beauty, Winnie had been known far and wide for her unmatched allure. Her beauty was the kind that could turn the coldest hearts warm, the kind that could draw smiles from even the most bitter souls. Her skin glowed with an ethereal radiance, earning her the nickname Snow White. She was not just another girl, she was a vision, a living masterpiece. But beauty was not the only thing she possessed. Winnie was the only child of an aristocratic family. Her parents, Damien and Thelma, adored her beyond measure. Winnie had been born into wealth, privilege, and what seemed like an unshakable life of luxury. Or so she thought. Everywhere she went, she dazzled. Her presence was magnetic. She had the kind of eyes that made people stop and stare, eyes so enchanting that they set her apart from everyone else. Even among a sea of faces, Winnie was unmistakable, and that was precisely why someone had wanted to take it all away. Winnie had only two friends, Mimi and Glory. They had been inseparable since their primary school days. But as they grew into adolescence, Winnie had blossomed differently. She was the one who stood out like a lily in a field of wildflowers, the one who captured all the attention. "Hey you, can I speak to you for a moment?" Dan called out as the three girls walked home under the scorching afternoon sun. They turned around to see him, the most intelligent and handsome boy in their class. "He's calling you," Mimi whispered excitedly to Winnie. Winnie, slightly surprised, turned to face Dan. "Are you talking to me?" she asked. But to everyone's shock, Dan shook his head and diverted his gaze. "No," he said, "I'm speaking to her." He pointed at Mimi. Mimi froze. Never in her life had a boy chosen her over Winnie. The realization sent an electric jolt through her. "Go!" Glory nudged her, eyes gleaming with excitement. The two girls could hardly contain their joy. Finally, someone was noticing Mimi instead of Winnie. Mimi, blushing, walked toward Dan, her heart pounding. "You called me?" she asked softly. Dan nodded, his expression turning serious. "Yes, I want to ask Winnie out, but I'm too shy. Can you please give this letter to her and tell her it's from me?" Mimi's blood ran cold. Just when she had started to feel she was beautiful too, the letter in Dan's hand, staring right in her face, destroyed whatever confidence in herself she had left. Dan had called her not because he wanted to ask her out, as she had expected, but rather to use her as a tunnel to get to Winnie. A slow, cold resentment crept into her chest, but she forced a smile. "Of course," she said, taking the letter with a calculated grin. "I'd be happy to help." Dan sighed in relief. "Thank you. Please make sure she gets it." Mimi turned and walked back to her friends, slipping the letter into her bag as she went. "So, how did it go?" Glory asked eagerly. "Oh." Mimi hesitated, then smirked. "Dan said he likes me and wants to take me out on a date." Glory seemed overly excited this time that it was Mimi and not Winnie who was getting the attention for a change. Winnie, on the other hand, was genuinely happy for her friend Mimi. Though she too had a crush on Dan, she truly did not mind if he had chosen Mimi instead. "See," Winnie said to Mimi with a smile. "I always tell you that you are beautiful. You really have to start seeing it yourself," Winnie said warmly to Mimi. She meant every word. She had always wanted Mimi to see her own worth, and she was genuinely happy for her. Unknown to Winnie, that jealousy had already begun to creep into the hearts of her two childhood best friends, and this jealousy had begun to turn into hatred. Hatred that had now made Mimi begin to lie and cheat, just based on her own insecurities around Winnie. Dan's love letter never reached Winnie, and so he spent days believing she had cruelly rejected him. A few days at school, before the incident, as Winnie wandered the school garden, Sandra, a classmate, suddenly approached her, her face tense with urgency. "There's something you need to know," Sandra whispered. "Stay away from the people you call friends. They are not who you think they are. Don't say I didn't warn you." And with that, she was gone before Winnie could even ask what she meant. Winnie stood frozen, her mind racing. Why was Sandra warning her? What did she mean? Before she could dwell on it, Mimi's voice called from across the field. "Winnie, hurry up! We're going to be late for practicals." Winnie hesitated, glancing in the direction Sandra had vanished. Then, with a sigh, she pushed the warning aside and walked toward her friends. But today, as Winnie moved through the school corridors, her face hidden behind the helmet, she knew something her enemies didn't. She knew who they were. Her suspects, her two best friends, Mimi and Glory. They say, "It is the one closest to you who knows how to hurt you the most." And with Sandra's warnings raging in Winnie's mind, she knew now that her own friends probably would have been the ones who tried to destroy her face, and she was going to get them to confess their crime. But as she walked, She was jolted back into reality when she heard a sudden ruffle of laughter at the school corridor. Winnie looked up, and the entire crowd of students standing in the corridor were all staring at her. Some were giggling under their breath, while others just stared in shock. "Why is she wearing a helmet?" some whispered. The glances did not stop, and Winnie hurried to her classroom to avoid the attention her helmet was causing. Adjusting to this new persona was hard for Winnie. She had never had anyone look at her weird in her life. She had always been a showstopper any time she stepped into the room, but things were different now. Her classmates stared at Winnie as she settled in her seat with even more confusion than the other students outside. It didn't take long before the questioning started. Everyone was curious to know why Winnie had suddenly begun wearing a helmet to school every day. Winnie deliberately told everyone, including Mimi and Glory, that she had been in an accident where someone poured acid on her face, leaving it completely destroyed. Very quickly, Winnie was dethroned from the most beautiful girl in Blossom Breed to the weirdo with a helmet. All the guys who used to bow at her feet suddenly began to ignore her whenever she passed by. All the teachers who used to smile and wink at her were now more strict and mean towards her. Adjusting to this new life was really hard for Winnie, and in these times when her beauty was hidden, she learned something she had never understood before. Beauty was a currency, and without it, she was worth nothing to anyone. Winnie realized just how fickle people's love and admiration can be, how fake people can be around you only when you are beautiful. But Winnie wasn't here to dwell on lost admiration. She had a mission. She was going to expose Mimi and Glory. The opportunity presented itself sooner than she expected. That morning, as Winnie stepped into the classroom, she saw something strange. Mimi crouched beside Glory's bag, her fingers slipping a small folded paper inside. Mimi's eyes darted around nervously, making sure no one was watching. Then she looked up and froze, her face drained of color as she locked eyes with Winnie. I didn't see you coming," Mimi stammered, forcing a nervous smile. Winnie raised a brow. "Are you trying to steal something?" she asked sarcastically, feigning ignorance. "Of course not," Mimi blurted. "I was just returning a textbook I borrowed earlier. Come on, let's go before assembly starts." Before Winnie could respond, Mimi grabbed her arm, trying to usher her away. But Winnie was smarter than that, and she played along. She waited until assembly was in full swing before sneaking back into the empty classroom. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she rushed toward Glory's bag, fingers searching for the paper. She found it. Unfolding it, her eyes scanned the words quickly. It read, "Meet me at the girls' restroom by 12:30 today. Come alone." A slow smirk formed beneath the helmet. Finally. At 12:30 sharp, Winnie hid behind the restroom door, her phone clutched in her hands, ready to record. Seconds later, Mimi and Glory rushed in, shutting the door behind them. Winnie held her breath. Then they began to talk. What Winnie heard made her blood run cold. Now that this happened to Winnie, "Do you think I should still give her Dan's letter?" Mimi's voice was laced with regret. "I actually feel bad for her. I regret getting jealous and hiding the letter from her. Do you think it's too late to tell her the truth?" "You should have given it to her a long time ago," Glory replied. "Now Dan will always think she rejected him when she was still beautiful. And after what happened, he'll never want her now." Winnie's fingers tightened around her phone. They were talking about a letter and jealousy. But nothing about the masked man, nothing about the acid, nothing about the setup. As the girls left the restroom, heading out to look for her, Winnie remained frozen in place. Rage burned through her veins. This wasn't the confession she wanted. She didn't care about a stupid letter. She didn't care about Dan anymore. She wanted justice, and she wasn't stopping until she got it. That evening, she stormed out of school, her helmet firmly in place. She refused to wait for her so-called friends. She was done playing games. Then, she saw it. Her father's car. It was parked by the corner, waiting for her. Winnie frowned. This was odd. Her father never sent the driver to pick her up from school. The tinted window slowly rolled down as if inviting her in. Confused but relieved, Winnie stepped forward and slid into the back seat. The door shut behind her with a quiet click. She turned to the driver. "Good afternoon, sir," she greeted politely. Silence. No response. The car began to move. Winnie settled back, assuming he hadn't heard her. But then the car picked up speed. Faster, faster. Something was wrong. Winnie's pulse quickened. Slowly, she leaned forward, trying to get a glimpse of the driver's face through the rearview mirror. And that's when she saw it. Not one, but two masked men sat in the front seat. Her blood turned to ice. This wasn't her driver, and this wasn't a ride home. This was a kidnapping. "Where are you taking me? Who are you?" Winnie screamed in panic, her voice trembling as she finally caught a glimpse of the driver's masked face. Her pulse pounded in her ears, her breathing ragged with fear. But the men remained silent, their grip firm, their expressions unreadable. "If you scream, we'll throw you out of this moving car." One of the men finally spoke, his voice hoarse and emotionless, as if he had uttered such threats countless times before, and meant every word. The car sped down the darkened road, the world outside blurring into streaks of colour. Winnie could barely process what was happening. She was being kidnapped inside her own father's car. Where are my parents? What have these men done to them? Then something sent a chill down her spine. The road they were taking, it was familiar. It led to her father's house. Her breath hitched. Had these men already killed her parents? Were they now taking her back to finish what they started? A dizzying wave of terror washed over her. Unable to bear the suffocating fear, Winnie's vision blurred, and the world around her faded to black. Hours later, Winnie lay motionless on the cold, hard ground. Darkness pressed in around her. Where am I? Still unconscious, her mind whispered desperate thoughts. I failed. Whoever tried to destroy me must have found out I was saved, that I had been hiding behind the helmet all this time. And now they've come to finish what they started. Regret tightened around her like a vice. I should not have waited. I should have gone to the authorities. But is it too late now? For me, for my family, for my future? She gasped as her body jolted back to life. She was awake, conscious, terrified. Then, without warning, someone yanked the helmet off her head. Dazed and disoriented, Winnie's eyes darted upward, adjusting to the dim light. A group of armed men loomed over her. Her heart nearly stopped. These weren't Mimi, nor Glory. Then suddenly, one of them stepped forward and took off her mask. Winnie's blood ran cold. It was her mother. Thelma stood in front of her, eyes dark with rage, her hands steady as she pointed a gun directly at Winnie's head. "I will be the one to end you for good," she spat, her voice venomous with hatred. Winnie felt her entire world shatter in an instant. Her mother? No, this had to be a mistake. A nightmare. Winnie froze, her lips trembling as she tried to form words, trying to understand. Mom? We need to get out of here, she stammered. These men, they're trying to kill me. Her voice cracked, thick with terror. But Thelma didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply stood there, her gun unwavering, her expression void of any emotion. The silence between them was deafening. Then realization struck like a lightning bolt. Winnie's breath hitched, her throat tightened. "Mom?" she whispered. "Why are you pointing a gun at me?" Tears welled in her eyes as she tried to blink away the horror unfolding before her. "Please, tell me what's going on. Where is Dad? Mom, why are you doing this?" But Thelma's response was chilling. She cracked the rifle, loading a bullet into the chamber with a deafening click. She hadn't come to talk. She had come to kill. "You brat!" Thelma seethed finally. "You're like a cockroach that refuses to die. I tried everything to end you, but somehow you keep surviving. But today there will be no escape." Winnie's entire body shook. "Mother, please. Whatever I have done to you, I'm sorry. I promise to be good. Please, don't kill me." "Don't you dare call me your mother," Thelma screamed, her voice cracking with fury. "I am not your mother. I was deceived, tricked into raising the child of my worst enemy. If I had known the truth from the start, you would have never lived to see your first birthday." Winnie gasped. Her body turned ice cold. What are you talking about, Mother?" Thelma's face twisted with bitterness. "I'll tell you exactly what I mean." Her grip on the gun tightened. Her voice was steady but filled with venom. Then she began. "You are Hannah's daughter, the child of a maid. A disgusting, worthless maid." Winnie's stomach twisted into knots. Her mind reeled. No, this wasn't real. This wasn't happening. Thelma's eyes gleamed with hatred. "Your father got his maid pregnant the night before our wedding," she continued, her voice dripping with disgust. "He said he had been drunk that night, but that wretched woman, she got pregnant. And what did Damien do? He wanted us all to live together. One big happy family. Imagine that. That was never going to happen." "I had worked too hard to be with Damien. I had fought too long, and I was supposed to compete with a maid. My children were supposed to share their inheritance with the child of a servant? Never." Winnie's chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked breaths. Thelma continued, her voice sharp as a blade. "I poisoned your mother's drink every day. Slow poison, so no one would suspect a thing. Her death had to look natural. And on the night she went into labor, I made sure she was too weak to survive it. I chased her out of my house, let her die somewhere far away." A cruel smirk crossed her face. "I was free. I had won. But the universe decided to punish me. I kept losing my pregnancies. No matter how much I tried, I could never bear a child of my own. I was being punished. And it was all because of you. You and your cursed mother." Winnie's body trembled violently. Her heart felt like it might explode. She had never known. This was beyond anything she could have imagined. "And then Damien," Thelma's voice wavered as she continued, her fury trembling on the edge of something raw. "I don't know how he found your mother's dead body on the streets, or how you survived. But he brought you back, pretended you were an orphan, and convinced me to adopt you as our own. For 16 years, I loved you like my own flesh and blood. I thought you were my savior. I breastfed you, clothed you, protected you, and all the while I never knew the truth. Until I found out what Damien had done, until I realized who you really were." "And that day, February 11th, I sent them to pour acid on you, to end you, to finally erase you from my life. I wanted you to feel every ounce of pain you ever made me feel before your death. But still," Thelma's eyes darkened, "still, you returned home untouched." Thelma gave a frustrated laugh. "How was that even possible? You refused to die." Winnie's breath hitched as the memory came rushing back. The day she had barely escaped. The day she thought her friends had betrayed her. It had never been them. It had been her mother. Tears streamed down Winnie's face as her entire world crumbled beneath her. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. Her body trembled violently, not just from fear, but from the sheer weight of the revelation crashing down on her. She wanted to believe this was a nightmare, a sick, twisted dream she would wake up from any moment now. But the cold barrel of the gun pointed at her forehead told her otherwise. Thelma's face was a mask of hatred, her fingers tightening around the trigger. "Mother!" Winnie's voice cracked again, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "No, this can't be true. You loved me. You raised me." "Lies!" Thelma spat, her eyes wild with fury. "I was tricked into loving you, deceived into nurturing the very seed of my enemy." Winnie shook her head frantically, trying to piece the horror together. She had spent 16 years believing she belonged, believing she was cherished, that she had a family, a home. But it had all been a lie. She was nothing, a shadow, a ghost from a past her mother had tried to erase. And now, Thelma was determined to finish the job. The armed men stood motionless behind Thelma, their faces unreadable. No one spoke. No one stopped her, Winnie's heart pounded violently against her ribcage. She wanted to run, scream, but her body was frozen. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, don't do this. I didn't choose to be born. I didn't choose any of this." Thelma let out a bitter laugh. "And yet here you are, ruining everything. My life, my marriage, my happiness, stolen because of you." Her hands steadied on the gun. Winnie could see it in her mother's eyes. This wasn't a bluff. She was going to pull the trigger. Thelma's face suddenly twisted into a satisfied smirk. "For 16 good years I have been fighting you, Winnie, trying to end you before you were born, before you could be more than what you already are." Thelma's face hardened with a bitter smile. She shook her head. "I have been failing." Then her voice intensified. "But you see, today, no one knows where we are. And this time there will be no escape. The universe has finally placed you in my hands." She raised the gun. "And you will pay for every tear you have made me shed." And this time there would be no escape. Thelma's finger pressed against the trigger. A sudden, deafening bang. The gunshot echoed through the darkened room. Winnie flinched, expecting pain, expecting her world to go black. But it didn't. She was still breathing. Thelma's eyes widened in shock. Her mouth fell open. She had fired the shot, but there was no bullet. Before Thelma could react, before she could order someone to shoot Winnie, a deafening crash shattered the tension. The police stormed in, their voices echoing through the underground basement. "Freeze! Drop your weapons!" they commanded. Thelma's heart pounded violently in her chest. Panic gripped her as she stumbled back. How had they found this place? This secret underground chamber, one that no one in the world was supposed to know about. And then Damien rushed in. Winnie felt his strong arms lift her from the cold, hard ground. His warmth, his presence. It was the only thing keeping her from completely breaking apart. Then he stood up and turned to Thelma. His face, once filled with love for the woman he married, was now consumed by disgust and betrayal. His voice was laced with pain as he spoke. "How could you?" he muttered, his words almost lost in the chaos. "How could you kill an innocent woman just because she bore my child?" Thelma's lips trembled. She couldn't meet his eyes. Shame weighed heavily on her. Damien was supposed to be at the office. She had been so careful, so meticulous, yet somehow he had found out. How did you know?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Damien shook his head. His gaze flickered toward a dusty old picture frame in the corner of the basement. "The frame," he said simply, his voice heavy with meaning. Thelma followed his gaze, and when her eyes landed on the frame, her breath caught in her throat. The frame. Memories came rushing back. She remembered Damien telling her years ago about his wealthy parents and the secret security measures they had installed throughout the mansion. Hidden cameras were embedded in small, unassuming picture frames. These frames were placed everywhere, even here. She had been caught. Thelma let out a guttural scream as she collapsed to the floor. How could she have forgotten such a crucial detail? How could she have slipped up like this? Her plan had been perfect. Kill Winnie, bury her in the underground basement where no one would ever find her, and be rid of the cursed girl forever. But now, it was all over. She lunged toward Winnie in a final act of desperation, but before she could get close, cold steel closed around her wrists. The snap of handcuffs sealed her fate. Thelma and her accomplices were dragged out of the mansion, their reign of terror finally over. Winnie sat quietly in the hospital bed as Damien held her hand. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything you had to go through. You are my daughter, my flesh and blood. And it never mattered who your mother was. You will always be my child, and I will always protect you." Tears welled in Winnie's eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt truly safe. When she returned to school, a sense of normalcy washed over her. The air felt fresher, the breeze cooler as it glazed over her naked skin, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Winnie could walk freely. Mimi and Glory spotted her from a distance. Their eyes widened in shock and excitement as they rushed toward her. "Winnie, your face!" Mimi gasped, barely able to contain her joy. We thought you'd never take that helmet off again," Glory added, guilt evident in her voice. They hesitated, then exchanged nervous glances before lowering their heads. "We need to tell you something," Mimi started, her voice small. We were jealous of you. We hid Ajik's letter." But before they could continue, Winnie held up her hand, stopping them. "I already know," she said, offering them a small, knowing smile. Mimi and Glory stared at her in shock. "You do? But how?" Winnie smirked playfully. "Well, a girl has her ways." Then she took their hands in hers. "From now on, let's be real friends," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "No more jealousy, no more rivalry. There's no reason to compete, no reason to let jealousy divide us. Beauty isn't just one thing, it comes in different shades just like a rainbow, and no matter the color, it shines just as bright. Boys will come and go, but true friends will always remain. You both mean more to me than any fleeting attention from a guy, so let's choose to lift each other up. Let's make each other shine." Mimi and Glory felt their hearts clench at Winnie's words. They had been so blinded by insecurity, so caught up in pointless rivalry, that they almost lost something far more valuable: true friendship. Her words broke them, and both girls promised to be better, to see their self-worth beyond a guy's attention and do better for themselves. With this newly found state of mind that Mimi and Glory now carried, they held Winnie's hand, more confident this time and more bold to face the world. Walking side by side, they no longer felt like shadows in her presence. Winnie's beauty no longer made them feel small. It reflected their own in a different way, in a different light. The three girls walked together happily, and that day marked the start of the newness of their friendship, one born out of love and a genuineness that these three would carry on for the rest of their lives. Winnie no longer had to hide, no more helmets, no more fear. She was finally set free from the shadows that hunted her, and so were her friends. From a shadowed corner of the school, an old woman watched with a gentle smile. Her eyes glowed with peace, knowing her child was safe. She had been powerless in her time on earth, just a helpless maid with no means to protect her daughter. But now she was in a better place. Now she was something more. She was a force, a protector, a guardian. And should anyone dare try to harm her child again, she would be waiting, not too far, not too close, just close enough, watching. With a final bittersweet smile, the old woman turned to leave, and though Winnie had not seen her, she knew someday she would return again. Hannah, Winnie's true mother, turned and disappeared into the ether. Her job was done. Her mission complete. For now. Thank you so much for watching. Please do not forget to subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to leave a like and a comment. We'll love to hear your feedback. Until we meet again, stay blessed, and I'll see you in our next story.